A $35 swim bait, hand-painted scales, holographic finish. You tied it on with shaking hands because it looked too pretty to throw. And the guy 2 spots down from you? He pulled a slice of white bread out of a sandwich bag, balled it up on a rusty hook, and dragged a 6-pound largemouth out of a stump pile you were too afraid to cast near. That actually happens, more often than any tackle company wants you to know. The global fishing lure market is barreling toward $5.4 billion. $5.4 billion, built on convincing you that a 50-cent piece of injection-molded plastic is worth $20, $30, sometimes $40 because it has a Pro Series label and a tournament angler's face on the box. They are engineering baits designed to catch you, not the fish. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on all of it. I'm going to show you why a $2 grocery store item has outfished premium tournament tackle by a factor of 16 in documented guide comparisons. That's not hype. That's a number I'll prove to you before this video is over. We're going deep into the biology of fish strikes, the psychology that's sabotaging your casts, and the dirt-cheap pantry baits that trigger feeding frenzies the tackle industry cannot replicate. Stay with me. Every section builds on the last, and if you skip ahead, you'll miss the piece that ties it all together. Part 1. The Great Lure Deception and the Science of Smell. Close your eyes for a second. Imagine you're blindfolded, standing in a pitch-black kitchen. You can't see a thing, but you can smell bacon frying 3 rooms away. You could walk straight to the stove with your eyes shut. That's how a fish hunts every single day of its life. You and I live in a world built on sight and sound. Fish exist in water where light dies within feet and sound scatters in every direction. Their survival depends on one thing: chemistry. They are tasting the water around them constantly, reading dissolved molecules the way you read a neon sign. Back in the 1970s, a University of Florida professor named Dr. Bill Carr spent decades cracking the code of fish feeding behavior. What he discovered demolished the foundation of the modern lure industry. He proved that what smells strong to a human means absolutely nothing to a fish. Fish don't detect airborne odors. They detect water-soluble chemical feeding stimulants, amino acids, fats, sugars dissolved in the water column. Think about catfish. A single catfish has a sense of smell estimated at 1,000 times more acute than a dog. Its entire body is carpeted in taste receptors. The thing is basically a swimming tongue. Now, think about what happens when you throw a $40 hard bait into that water. It vibrates, it flashes, it does everything a tackle commercial promised. But it leaves zero biochemical trail. None. A predatory fish might feel the vibration through its lateral line and drift over to investigate. But when it gets close, and there's no chemical confirmation, no signature of protein, no trace of fat, it turns away. That's why you get short strikes. That's why fish follow your lure to the boat and peel off at the last second. They came for the noise. They left because there was nothing to eat. Cheap, natural baits completely bypass this wall. They release amino acids, sugars, fats, and proteins that dissolve into the water and create a physical scent highway fish can track from enormous distances. You're not just showing them something shiny. You're hijacking their biological hardwiring. But even understanding scent won't save you if there's a second trap working against you. And this one is entirely inside your head. Part 2. Lure loss anxiety and the 80-20 rule. Be honest with yourself right now. Last time you were on the water, how many casts did you pull back on because you didn't want to lose that lure? There's a principle in business called the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. In bass fishing, it's not a theory, it's law. 80% of the fish are holding in 20% of the water. And where is that 20%? It's in the ugliest, nastiest structure on the lake, deep inside submerged timber, tangled in heavy muck, wedged between jagged rock piles and suffocated by thick weed beds. That's the kill zone. That's where the monsters live. Now, picture that brand new $35 swim bait hanging off your line. Are you going to fire it dead center into a sunken tree where there's a 90% chance you'll snag and snap off? Of course not. You suffer from what I call lure loss anxiety. Your bait is a financial investment, so you fish the margins. You cast to the safe water. You are subconsciously avoiding the exact spots where the biggest fish are stacked. Swap that swim bait for a $2 grocery store bait, and the anxiety evaporates. You don't care if you lose a piece of bread or a chunk of hot dog in that stump pile. You'll rip casts into the gnarliest, most hopeless cover on the lake, fearlessly, because you've got nothing to lose. And that is exactly where the monster bass, the giant carp, the trophy catfish are waiting. That single mindset shift will change your fishing forever. And the baits I'm about to hand you? Losing 10 of them still costs less than one cast with your fancy swim bait. Part 3. The Forbidden $2 Baits. All right, grab a pen. We're walking straight into the kitchen pantry, and I'm going to arm you with baits that cost pocket change, but deliver biological triggers that no synthetic manufacturer on Earth can replicate. Bait number 1. Bread dough and the resistance trigger. The oldest trick in the book, and the one the industry prays you'll forget about. A loaf of plain white bread. Under $2. Enough bait for dozens of trips. But you're not just balling it up and lobbing it out there. You knead that bread tight around the shank of your hook until it forms a dense, doughy paste. In the water, it breaks down slowly, dispersing a cloud of carbohydrate particles that pulls in carp, bream, and panfish like a silent dinner bell. Here's the real secret nobody talks about. Texture. When a fish bites compressed bread dough, there's a split second of micro-resistance before the bait gives way. That tiny moment of crunch mimics a natural prey item, an insect shell, a seed casing, and it triggers a full commit strike reflex. Commercial soft plastics spend millions trying to engineer that exact give. Bread does it naturally, for free. Bait number 2. Sweet corn and the vanilla hack. A can of sweet corn, less than $1. Brilliant yellow, high-contrast silhouette that pops in murky water. Sugary scent profile that fish absolutely lose their minds over. But we're not using it straight out of the can. The night before your trip, crack the can open, drain a little liquid, and drop in a few drops of pure vanilla extract or anise oil. Let it soak overnight. Vanilla and anise are incredibly potent water-soluble chemical stimulants. That corn kernel keeps its natural look, but its scent dispersal radius in the water doubles or triples. You're pulling fish from way outside your casting zone before they ever see the bait. And if you're targeting giant carp, you need to pair this with a technique that changed European match fishing forever, the hair rig. Development in the 1970s, instead of threading corn onto the hook, where fish feel the metal and spit it, you thread the kernel onto a tiny loop of line dangling just below the hook point. Carp feed by sucking in water and blowing it out. They inhale the corn, feel nothing suspicious, and when they turn to swim away, the exposed hook catches the corner of their mouth and sets itself. It is an inescapable trap. Bait number 3, the stink dog and the cherry chicken protocol. If you want to wreck catfish and stack up massive panfish, you need to exploit their obsession with salt, fat, and protein. Start with the cheapest hot dogs on the shelf. the ones loaded with filler, emulsified fats, and preservatives. When those hit the water, the sodium and processed fat leak out, creating a scent signature that fish can't categorize but absolutely registers as a high-calorie meal. Now let's take it further. Cut raw chicken thighs into thumb-sized chunks and toss them in a Ziploc bag. Dump in a packet of black cherry Kool-Aid powder and a heavy dose of garlic powder. Seal it, shake it, let it sit. The garlic masks the human scent and oils from your hands. The cherry Kool-Aid dyes the meat a vivid, bloody red and loads it with an intense sugar signal. Catfish demolish this. It stays on the hook like cement and lays down a massive flavor trail that buries $20 commercial stink baits. Bait number 4, spoiled shrimp and the pantyhose hack. Chicken liver and spoiled shrimp are legendary catfish killers. Liver is a sponge of pure blood and amino acids that travels downstream like a dinner bell ringing with every current pulse. But here's the problem everyone hits. Liver is mushy. It flies off on the cast, or little bait stealers nibble it to nothing in seconds. Here's the veteran fix that solves it permanently. Grab a pair of old pantyhose or fine mesh. Cut a small square. Place your chunk of liver or shrimp inside, pull the mesh tight, and tie it off with thread to make a little bait ball. Run your hook right through the mesh. The pantyhose holds the soft meat together through violent casts and hard current, but the porous fabric lets 100% of the blood and scent disperse into the water. Problem solved. And if you want something even tougher without the mesh, ask your butcher for turkey livers. Naturally firmer, work just as well. Bait number 5. Marshmallows, the unfair advantage. You're going to think I've lost my mind. A $2 bag of mini marshmallows. Hear me out. Hatchery-raised, stocked trout have been conditioned from birth to eat floating, light-colored food pellets dropped from above. When you drift a small white marshmallow in the current, you're not imitating an insect. You're matching the exact feeding history of that fish's entire life. It triggers a hardwired instinct that bypasses every survival alarm in its brain. And marshmallows float. Rig a slip sinker on the bottom, and your marshmallow hovers suspended in the water column at eye level, waving gently in the current. Perfectly visible, perfectly irresistible. Bait number 6. Processed cheese and ivory soap. Yes, soap. Before you click away, listen. Die-hard catfish hunters have known for decades that pure bar soap, specifically ivory soap or the Mexican brand Zote, is a devastating bait. Why? Because pure soaps contain animal fats and lards that leach slowly into the water, and ivory carries just enough scent to drive big whiskerfish insane without the harsh chemical additives that repel them. If soap sounds too wild, use cheap processed cheese slices or canned spray cheese. Ball it tight on the hook. The extreme sodium, high fat, and neon orange color give you a dual threat, olfactory and visual, that hammers carp and catfish. And it needs zero refrigeration in your tackle box. It just sits there, ready to work all day long. Part 4. The WD-40 controversy exposed. We need to talk about the single most polarizing secret in the entire angling community, WD-40. For years, the rumor has been the same. Old school guys spray their lures or marinate their chicken in WD-40 and claim it guarantees a strike. The myth is that the lubricant contains fish oil or some hidden attractant formula. Let me set the record straight. WD-40 is a water displacement solvent. It is petroleum-based. The company itself has publicly stated there is no fish oil in the product. None. So why do some guys swear by it? It creates a high-viscosity slick on the water, and its aggressive chemical odor might trigger a curiosity strike from certain species. But here's the part nobody wants to hear. Spraying petroleum into a waterway is illegal and toxic to the ecosystem. In states like California, Illinois, and Washington, using WD-40 as a fish attractant will land you a massive fine and potentially a lifetime ban from the water. It is not worth it. Do not use it. Now, if you want a medicine cabinet hack that actually works and won't get you arrested, look at Preparation H. I know, but the classic ointment contains up to 3% shark liver oil. Anglers have successfully applied it to dough baits and soft plastics because that shark liver oil releases a legitimate biological scent signal into the water. Stick to the biology. Leave the garage chemicals at home. Part 5. Foraging and the power of pre-baiting. Everything I've shown you so far costs pocket change. But what if I told you the deadliest bait on Earth costs you absolutely nothing? $0. You just have to go get it. I'm talking about local invertebrates, freshwater shrimp, native crayfish, and self-caught night crawlers. The ecosystem's own weapons turned against itself. Those dozen worms you buy at the bait shop for $5, they're stressed, dehydrated, and half dead. They barely twitch. But if you spend 10 minutes with a flashlight after a rainstorm, you can collect your own night crawlers that are fat, hydrated, and alive. A fresh worm thrashes violently on the hook, sending frantic distress vibrations and a massive natural scent trail through the water. The difference in strike rate between a store-bought worm and a wild-caught worm is not even close. And if you really want to stack the deck, you need to learn the European tactic of pre-baiting. Go to a farm supply store, buy a 50-pound bag of cracked feed corn for pennies a pound. 3 days before your trip, visit your spot and scatter a few handfuls of that corn into the water. Do it again the next day. You are chemically conditioning the fish to associate that exact GPS coordinate with free, safe food. By the time you show up with your rod on day 3, the fish are already there. They're patrolling the area in aggressive feeding mode. Your hook bait doesn't need to convince them of anything. You've rigged the game before you made a single cast. Part 6. The Barometric Cheat Code. I can hand you the greatest bait ever assembled, but if you fish it at the wrong time, you're dead in the water. The ultimate fishing secret isn't in the water at all. It's in the sky. Barometric pressure. Remember this term. It will change the way you plan every trip for the rest of your life. Fish have a gas-filled organ called a swim bladder that controls their buoyancy. That bladder is hypersensitive to the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on the water's surface. On those beautiful, clear, bluebird sky days, the days everyone wants to fish, barometric pressure is high. It compresses the swim bladder. Fish feel uncomfortable, lethargic. They tuck into deep cover, clamp their jaws shut, and refuse to eat. If you're ripping a $40 crankbait on a high-pressure day, you are going to get skunked. You need to downsize, slow down, and put natural, high-scent baits right on their nose. But when a storm front starts rolling in, barometric pressure drops. The squeeze on the swim bladder releases. Fish feel relief, and their instincts scream that a harsh weather event is coming and they need to feed. Now. What happens? Absolute chaos. An aggressive, gluttonous feeding frenzy. Track the barometric pressure on any weather app. When it's falling, specifically between 29.8 and 29.6 inches of mercury, get on the water. Burn those numbers into your brain, 29.8 to 29.6. That's the kill window. Now, combine a dropping barometer with a pre-baited spot and a $2 modified grocery store bait, you become virtually unstoppable. Everything I just told you costs less than a single premium lure, and every word of it is backed by decades of ichthyological research and field-tested results from anglers who stopped buying the lie. The tackle industry doesn't need you to be a better fisherman. They need you to stay confused, to keep chasing the next magic lure, to keep swiping your credit card on plastic that looks like art but performs like nothing. The anglers who consistently land trophy fish aren't the ones with the most expensive gear. They're the ones who understand the chemistry of the water, the psychology of their own casting decisions, and the weather patterns that dictate when fish feed. Here's my challenge to you. Pick 3 things from this video. Maybe it's soaking sweet corn in vanilla extract tonight. Maybe it's wrapping chicken liver in pantyhose this weekend. Maybe it's downloading a barometric pressure app before your next trip. Commit to those 3 tactics for 30 days. Your catch rate will explode, and your wallet will breathe for the first time in years. Every video on this channel is another page ripped from the playbook they don't want you to read. If you're done buying the lie and ready for the truth, hit subscribe. Drop a comment and tell me which 3 tactics you're testing this weekend. Welcome to the Forbidden Lures Brotherhood. Stay sharp, fish smart, and we'll see you on the water.